someone who inspired us, someone who mentored us, and someone who really brought meaning to the whole notion of how we learn about each other and how we learn about the place. And so I'm really glad that you've all agreed to participate in this session on Richard Nelson. We'll start with Debbie Miller. Debbie, I think, shares a lot of the love of the outdoors, the writing skills that Nels portrayed, and the sense of adventure, the sense of discovery, the sense of explaining it to other people with enthusiasm. And so we'll start with Debbie and her presentation. Debbie.
Okay, thank you, Bill. And thank you, everybody that's helped put this together, particularly Karen, with all the training to make sure that we can Zoom successfully and not have any problems. Now, I'm assuming you can see me and hear me. Are we okay, Bill?
Yeah, we're okay. You have 20 minutes and I'll set my clock timer.
Okay, awesome, awesome.
So, Debbie, when you're ready, you share your screen whenever you're
yes,
ready to do
but
that.
you can see me now, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I'll share my screen in a few minutes, but I wanted to share some things that I have here. First off, again, thank you for hosting this, the Alaska Historical Society, and all the people that have put this historical Zoom conference together. And I also want to recognize where I am right now, which is in Sitka, where you all were supposed to be. And if we look out the window, I'll just hold up the computer, you'll see Jamestown Bay and the view from Richard Nelson's house, better known as Nels, formerly known as Dick, but most people now know him as Nels. And he has lived in this house where I am sitting for about 36 years. So definitely his heart and soul and love is here in Sitka, and I wish all of you could be here instead of on Zoom. So it's interesting, when I first moved to Alaska back in 1975, I was teaching as a 24-year-old in Arctic Village, a Gwich'in Athabascan-speaking village north of Fort Yukon, right on the boundary of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And of course, I was new to the area, knew nothing about the Gwich'in culture. So the first thing I did upon arriving was I tried to find books to read about the Gwich'in people. And of course, little did I know that Richard Nelson, had just finished his PhD and had just written a book about the Gwich'in people in Chalkitsik, which was really right down the road, about 100 miles south and east of where I was teaching as this young, didn't know anything teacher. I was reading his book. And at the same time that I was reading this book, he was in Huslia at that time studying the Koyukon people and their life ways. And so, so that was my introduction. I think many of us got to know, that have known Nels for a long time, grew to know him through his books. Later on, I began writing myself, and Nels was a great mentor to me. We both worked on books at the same time. I was writing Midnight Wilderness, my first book about the Arctic, when he was writing Island Within, and we would share notes back and forth, living in different places, but a good friendship and working colleague. And when I wrote a book for kids about polar bears, of course, I wanted to go see them with my own eyes. I wanted to get up on the sea ice and learn about the bears firsthand. So another book just popped into my hand, which was Nels's first book, Hunters of the Northern Ice, which is a fabulous read about living in Wainwright back in the 1960s that Hank will be talking about those times. But this helped me in a tremendous way in doing the research and learning what it was going to be like for me to be going up on that sea ice and looking for polar bears with Craig George, who was a biologist up there who helped me with the writing of my polar bear book. So Nels was a great resource, a great teacher, a great friend and mentor for many years. Our lives really intersected about 9 years ago when we worked on this book together, which was really a joy. The last essay that Nels wrote was in this book that we collaborated on together. And in doing this book, we paddled about 100 miles down the Utakak River, amazingly wild place in the Western Arctic. And Nels had heard about this river through an elder named Michael Kayatak in Wainwright, who had grown up on the Utakak River, but Nels had never been there. And so as we were paddling through this wild, wild country, we came across a little ridge that had an archaeological site that had never been described. And we were picking up flakes and pieces of church, and we had no idea how old this site was. Might have been hundreds of years old or thousands of years old, but this connected him back to his time when he was first in Alaska, living with the Inupiaq people in Wainwright. And he wrote a beautiful essay in this book called Voices of the Land. It was his last piece of writing that was published. And then before I get into the images, I have a few to share just to celebrate his wonderful life. I picked a few things around the house because I'm sitting in this wonderful house full of Nels, and I wanted to share a few things with you. His favorite book of all time is this book, The Peregrine by John Baker. We both have read it. It's a wonderful book. It's the kind of book you pick up, you open it randomly, you read any paragraph, and it's like a beautiful piece of literature. So this was a favorite that we often would read and that he loved. Nels also loved Henry David Thoreau, and oftentimes when he had favorite books, he would actually index the books on the inside of the cover, and he'd write down his favorite quotes and his favorite writings with the page number. Occasionally he would put a double asterisk if he really liked a quote. And this one I thought was really great. I thought, oh, why did he put 2 stars by this quote? And so I opened it up and it says, very short, Henry David Thoreau. Let me see man a farming, a hunting, a fishing, a walking, anything but a shopping, which just really made me laugh because Nels did not like to shop. I mean, in and out of stores, please. He'd much rather be out fishing, hunting, exploring, enjoying our beautiful world around us. But that's the way he read books. He underlined everything with a pencil that meant something to him, that he loved, any passage. For all, Aldo Leopold was a mentor, Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, John Muir. These were people that he had read all of their works, and I think this really inspired him with his own writing and his own study of nature and indigenous people. By his bed, had to mention this. This is a book by our friend Tom Griffiths in Australia, but this was the book by his bed this morning that he was reading before we left Alaska last September when he grew ill. And this is a wonderful book for historians. It's won national awards in Australia. Tom Griffiths is a dear friend, and he's an environmental historian. And he profiled the lives of 14 historians in Australia. And even though we're in Alaska, if you're an historian, you might enjoy this book. It's gotten rave reviews. And Tom is a dear friend that we saw every year when we would go on our trips to Australia. A couple more things with Sharon. I see Sharon now. Did you want to say something? No, okay. I just saw your face, so I thought, maybe you were going to say something. But a few other things about Nels in the house. He was a collector. Everything from an emu egg from Australia to a beautiful red rock from New South Wales to a rock from the Utakak River going down in the canoe to a rock from the Shinjik River in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. These were precious, the rock collection, rocks from all over Alaska, all over Canada, all over Australia. And I think we're going to go to the pictures. Was there one more thing? Oh, seeds. Things like, just to give you an idea, he took the time to collect eucalyptus seeds in Australia and then framed them. So he had an eye for detail. He loved all the things in nature, not just the birds that he recorded the voices of, but seeds, feathers, bones. He looked at everything like a curious boy that never lost his sense of wonder and enthusiasm for the natural world. So this is a gift to all of us, his enthusiasm and his love for nature and for people. And so now we'll switch to the slides. I got to share my screen. Okay, let's see if I do this right now. Please help me, everybody. Boom. There we are. There it works. It works. It works. Full screen. There we go. Let's hope it works. There we are. So everybody can see that? Great. So this is a picture that was taken back when Nels was in his early 30s, probably in Huslia. And I just love this picture that really shows you what he looked like back in the day when he was out dog mushing and exploring those lands with the Koyukon people. Out the window, his boat, his skiff, which took him everywhere in Sitka Sound and beyond to all the islands. And this is the view from the kitchen window of the home that he's lived in for over 3 decades. From the living room window every morning, this is his place of love. This is the home that really says Nels and who he was. Most of his life he's lived here. In the winter, still a beautiful place. Even though he escaped to Australia, I think deep down he loved the winter as well, especially going out hunting on places like Kruzof Island. A refrigerator really tells you a lot about a man. So I put this picture in because so many good quotes are on the refrigerator that he saved over the years. And one of my favorites that he just put a little Post-it note in the middle of the refrigerator that says, "Be quick to listen and slow to speak." And that is so Nels. He was a deep, deep listener. And by doing that, he learned. And that's what he was, a natural anthropologist, by being a listener and observing. He was a keen observer. And so these quotes really are treasures. One of the favorite ones that I love is Maya Angelou. "People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And Nels had a way of making you feel good. And he just had a love for people. And it didn't matter if it was a cashier or if it was, my favorite story, his agent Susan, when he went to New York and he got lost on the streets of New York and he couldn't find his way, and he went to a police officer to ask for directions. Not only did he get the directions, but the police officer had one of those, what do you call them? Belly clubs, is that what you call them? Like a baton, you know, that they use. And the officer taught him how to spin it. So he's out there on the street learning what the officers do. I love that story. And that's the way he was with everyone, always wanting to learn. Of course, when he wasn't at home, he was out in the wilderness, hunting on Kruzof Island. This is a December day. He's kayaking in from the boat. I'm already on shore, and we're looking for deer on his beloved island where Mount Edgecombe rises above Sitka Sound, Kruzof Island. And in the summer, we would camp sometimes in places like this on Kruzof Island, looking across towards Sitka and Baranof Island in the distance. And the bears, the wonderful bears. But I picked a series of photos just quickly to show you how much he loved harvesting and getting food for us. And it was more than just catching a fish for Nels. There was so much into every fish. He was a great fisherman, but he also learned about the fish. He read books about fish, the best being King of Fish by David Montgomery. He would tell everybody to read that book if he was here. And And so he studied the lives of fish, the physiology, the history, the culture, traditional knowledge, and then he shared it. He would take all that information, and in a beautiful way as a teacher, he would share it with anyone, with children. In this case, it's a group of people from all over the country. The board of the Alaska Wilderness League was here last summer for a meeting, and we walked up Indian River, and he was teaching them about the rainforest. And the fish were spawning at that time, the pink salmon run, so it was a beautiful time. He also taught people, like this young student that was a student of George and Sharon Gmelch, the next speakers, who wanted to learn how to fillet a salmon. So he pulled out his ulu that he had had since Wainwright days in the 1960s. He could do a beautiful job on filleting a fish. I could never even begin to try to do what a great job he did. And best barbecue guy ever in the world. He knew how to cook fish. Beyond Sitka, he loved the big wild. And in 2011, we floated this river, the Utcock River, and you can see how big a landscape this is these are our tents. Way down here, these two little dots are the tents. And we floated 100 miles down this river. He recorded the Alaska marmot, a special population that only lives in the Brooks Range. And of course, the little caribou that walked right up to our tent. I don't know if you can hear this, but we'll see. And so we have
5 more minutes.
Yeah, thank you. And so other trips, we paddled up College Fjord in Prince William Sound when I was working on a book project, and Nels was recording the voices. We were taking photographs, exploring the land, paddling our way amongst the icebergs. Incredible trip. And what always amazed me about Nels when we would travel is he would see things in nature. He'd see an animal or something in nature, and he would remember the name for that animal, or that a glacier or a tree. He would remember the name in the Koyukon language or in the Inupiaq language. He'd remember phrases and stories, and he was incredibly gifted with language and music. And he played the didgeridoo. My favorite photo is on the Nezetlin River. We figured that we camped in a tent about at least 60 days out of the year, every year that we were together. So this is one of my favorite shots, as we were paddling down a river that runs into Teslin Lake in the Yukon, and I was working on a book about salmon. So that was, Nels was a great canoe partner for that. And last, I can't not close without showing you a few pictures of Australia. This was a place that was a big part of his heart and soul. For 20 years, he went to Australia, 20 different trips. The last trip, we became obsessed with this bird, the superb lyrebird, and we had to go into the rainforest and hunt for these birds by listening. And we found them through our ears, through the parabolic, through the headphones. And sometimes I was lucky enough, as he was recording the music of these amazing birds, I would catch a little glimpse of what they were doing with their choreography, their dance, and their feathers. And this is a glimpse. So I'd like all of us to remember Nels for his passion for nature and wild country, for his deep listening, and for his joy of just doing all that he did in his life, from his books to his wonderful encounters programs, over 100 programs that we can listen to. Every day we can hear his voice through the encountersnorth.org website, which is a gift, a legacy that will last forever. And then also films. He's been a narrator, and he's contributed wonderful sounds to a number of films that he's collaborated on with Liz McKenzie, and one that will be coming out hopefully in the next year called The Singing Planet. So we have all these things to look forward to that really we are grateful. I am grateful that his spirit will live on, and hopefully in all of you. And thanks so much for being here. And now we'll pass it back to Bill or on to George and Sharon. Thanks.
Thank you. Perfect timing and a great talk. You really gave us a sense of the man as you know him. Well, next is George and Sharon Gmelch, who went to graduate school with Nels and had kept up a relationship with him over the years and did different projects in areas where Nels had worked, as well as where he lived in Sitka. So George and Sharon, tell us your story. Do we have George and Sharon? Sharon.
Mute.
Yeah, yep.
Oh,
I'm unmuted now, I think.
okay, great.
And 1 second to thank you. And I think there will inevitably be, but it reinforces each other, a lot of overlap between some of the things that Debbie said, and I'm sure some of the things that Hank will have to say too. I'm going to do share screen. I have some slides, and George is here with me listening, but we decided it'd be easier if one person said what we have to say. And this will focus on Nels's anthropology and the things that, you know, it contributed to. So let me share screen. And again, keep my fingers crossed. All right. Okay. Slideshow. From beginning. All right.
Looking good.
All right, good. Well, Nels was a great friend for over 50 years of both of us. And we wrote his obituary for the American Anthropologist. So some of what I'm saying here is I've kind of taken it from that obituary in which we interviewed various of his former colleagues too. So it's primarily based on our 50-year friendship with Nels, but also on the memories and assessments of others. So as Debbie said, Richard King Nelson was known mainly as Nels to his friends. When we first met him, as Debbie also mentioned, he was known as Dick. But in many, I don't know, at least the last 20 years, he's been Nels to most of his friends, and probably longer than 20 years. At any rate, Nels was born on December 1st in 1941 in Madison, Wisconsin. His father was an administrative assistant for the state's Office of Unemployment Compensation. His mother, Florence, both of whom I had the privilege of meeting, collected antiques and was a very energetic entrepreneur who bought and refurbished and sold homes. When we were, especially in graduate school and throughout later years, Nels often liked to joke about his simple Midwestern and Norwegian upbringing, one in which ketchup was an exotic condiment, salad had no dressing, and dessert, more often than not, was Jell-O with mini marshmallows. He was an indifferent student through high school, and as Hank has written about in his book, he much preferred exploring Madison's lake shores and sloughs for turtles and snakes than being in the classroom. Nevertheless, he did enroll in the University of Wisconsin in 1959, majoring in zoology before changing to cultural anthropology. And while he was still a master's student, his professor, William Laughlin, helped him secure a contract to conduct research for a sea ice survival manual for Air Force pilots flying reconnaissance missions over the Arctic. So in 1964, at just 22, he went to Wainwright, which Debbie has mentioned. And he went there to learn from the experts, from the Inupiat who lived there. And he relied on anthropology's Hallmark methodology, participant observation, which simply means immersing yourself in the culture and learning by watching, listening, and doing. Let me go to the next slide. And that's what Nels did. He acquired a dog team. He learned to hunt and trap alongside the Inupiaq teacher, his Inupiaq teachers. It was an approach he would follow, you know, in all his subsequent research in Alaska and Native communities. And that's his first book, Hunters of the Northern Ice, and Shadow of the Hunter is a book of stories also based on this research in Wainwright. George and I met Nels in 1968 as students in the anthropology department. We're all working towards our PhDs at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He arrived there with a master's degree from Wisconsin, and his book, based on the Wainwright research, Hunters of the Northern Ice, already in press with the University of Chicago Press. Needless to say, it was somewhat intimidating for the rest of us to be a companion as newbies with this person who already had a book in press with the University of Chicago and had spent a year in the Arctic. Nels was a strong advocate of descriptive ethnography and very dismissive of the increasing importance of theory in cultural anthropology. For his doctoral research, he went to the Gwich'in Athabascan village of Chalkitsik, where he embraced their boreal forest life, recording it in voluminous field notes. And back at UCSB, he wrote a 1,000-page draft of his dissertation, only to be told by his chair, Thomas Harding, to cut it in half. This is more than anyone ever wanted to know about moose hunting, Nels later told us that Harding had said to him. And reluctantly, he complied, slashed his dissertation, but then also had to add a couple analytical chapters where he was comparing the Gwich'in to the Inupiat. This was in order to satisfy Harding's demand for more analysis. And the resulting book is one that Debbie has mentioned, Hunters of the Northern Forest, Designs for Survival Among the Alaskan Gwich'in. And it was published again by University of Chicago Press. But interestingly, when the second edition, which might be obscured by us, the speakers, on the right side of the screen, appeared about 13 years later, he dropped those two analytical chapters. And he wrote this in the preface in order to explain his position. Purely descriptive ethnography is valid and essential in its own right. Anthropologists are aware that good description is virtually timeless, while preferences in theory are as changeable as the winds that blow through Gwich'in country. And I think that captures his outlook. In 1972, Nels gave up the first academic job he had at the University of Hawaii, Honolulu, a job as fellow graduate students we saw him work hard to interview well in order to get. He then spent, after he left Hawaii, several months as a visitor at Memorial University in Newfoundland, where we were at that time, before he returned to Alaska, where he began conducting research for a newly created National Park Service unit studying Native American subsistence activities on federal lands. Nels's anthropological approach to the study of subsistence became the model for the NPS and later for the Subsistence Division of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, which produced many monographs about subsistence. And one of those was based on research in Sitka that the three of us collaborated on. And there's an image outside of, not far from Nels' front window. According to ethnobiologist and writer Gary Nabhan, quote, Nels set the standard for how one looked at subsistence, not just quantifying the fish and game natives harvested and where, but looking broadly at the cultural significance and values associated with subsistence practices. Although Nels did teach at several universities during his career, after he left Hawaii, it was always as a short-term visitor. And following such a visiting position at the University of Washington, however, he did apply for and received the offer of a permanent position in the anthropology department there, but remembers Eugene Hunn, who chaired the search committee, quote, I wasn't convinced he was going to accept it. He was such a free spirit. I couldn't see him being altogether happy in a faculty role, attending department meetings and committee work. Sure enough, he turned the job down to return to Alaska. Nels's extensive research in the Athabascan communities of Huslia, Hughes, and Allakaket was a transformative experience. In the words of friend and fellow anthropologist Richard Caulfield, it resulted in Nels transitioning from, quote, working strictly in an academic and scholarly tradition into a career that helped others gain a much deeper and profound understanding of Alaska's diverse peoples and their relationship to the natural world. His Athabascan research culminated in the book you see on the left, Make Prayers to the Raven, a Koyukon view of the Northern Forest. This is a very elegant account of their spiritual connection to the natural world. And it's this book that really brought Nels's work to the attention of the country's leading nature writers, and also generated invitations to give keynote addresses at a number of college campuses. And in Make Prayers, if you can read the quote, I'll read it for you. My greatest wish, Nels says, is that every page of this book should reflect my admiration for them, should accurately record their teachings, and should have value and significance in their lives during these difficult times of change, end quote. And this brief and self-effacing statement, which is characteristic of Nels, in the view of his former colleague and archaeologist Grant Spearman, quote, was an apt summation of his approach to both personal and professional life as he grew from insightful anthropologist to esteemed environmental writer and activist. A part-time television, or 5-part rather, television series, Make Prayers to the Raven, soon followed the book. And this was directed by Mark Badger and narrated by Barry Lopez. Nels was the associate producer and wrote the script, but insisted that control over the filming rest with a Koyukon Council of Elders and that he not appear on camera. The series was broadcast in the US on PBS, in Canada on CBC, and worldwide on BBC. It's still used today in some anthropology classes. And part 1, titled Passage of Gifts, in particular, shows how categories, religion, the environment, community, food, are all that are typically treated separately in Western cultures, are thoroughly intertwined among the Koyukon. And I'm just going to play a little bit of this. I think I'm going to play it to give you an introduction. It's to a different segment than the one I just mentioned. Let's see.
There is an unwritten account of creation, another way of living, another view of our relationship to earth and nature. This other view is found among a people who live just below the Arctic Circle in the northwest part of North America. Here, in the forests of interior Alaska, in 11 villages along portions of the Yukon and Kayukuk rivers, live the Koyukon Indians, members of the Athabascan family. This is the world Raven made. Joe Beatus's song drifts across the land where he was born, the land where countless generations of hunters have walked before him. It is late fall, the salmon have passed, and the nets are being stored for winter as a new season begins. Under the raven's watchful eye, Joe Beatus will soon travel the winding reaches of the Kayukuk River, hunting for moose to feed his family.
In Sitka, Nels's much-loved home, he turned his anthropological lens inward and spent a Walden Pond-like year on Kruzof Island. Excuse me. Here with his dog Kita, and in a tiny temporary cabin he built, he hunted, explored, and pondered his own relationship to the natural world, applying all that he had learned from Alaska natives. By the end, he had several thousand pages of journal entries and notes that became the basis for The Island Within. In a review of the book, writer Annie Dillard wrote, quote, "Anyone can see stuff and learn facts. It's what you make of it. I finished The Island Within out of breath. You almost have to hold a gun to my head to make me read nature writing, but I'd crawl over broken glass for Richard K. Nelson," end quote. The book went on to win the prestigious John Burroughs Medal for Distinguished Natural History Writing and later the Lannan Literary Award for Creative Nonfiction. Nell's last major writing project resulted in Heart and Blood, Living with Deer in America, which examined the human-deer relationship across the US, from Alaska natives to Wisconsin hunters to suburbanites living on Long Island. In addition to Nell's own keen observations, he interviewed extensively with deer hunters, ranchers, park rangers, scientists, homeowners, and more. And in the words of anthropologist Madonna Moss, Nelson's style glides easily between that of the scientist synopsizing technical literature, the journalist reporting key facts, the ethnographer chronicling the contradictions of human behavior, and the poet relating a moving experience, end quote. The book articulated Americans' complex and problematic relationship with this species and later won a major nature writing award.
About 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you, Bill. In 2004, Nels began producing a radio series which Debbie briefly mentioned, Encounters, which aired on NPR affiliates. Each episode about animals and natural phenomena in both Alaska and Australia was thoroughly researched, recorded in the field, and enthusiastically delivered. Here are just a couple minutes from the opening of the program, and you can get a sense of Nels's personality.
Hi, Amateur Nelson for Encounters, a program of observations, experiences, and reflections on the world around us. Well, today, I am one of the luckiest guys in the world. I'm in the place that I love more than I love anywhere else. It's an island off the Alaska coast, a wild place, big, well inhabited with lots of other creatures than humankind. The beach in front of me, sandy beach with some boulders on the ocean side of it, surge coming in out there off the ocean, some islands strewn around on this glittering sea on a brilliant, clear, perfectly clear, not a cloud in the sky type of a day. Lots of deer tracks on the beach. And what I don't see on the beach right now, though I certainly just as well could, is any tracks of the brown bears or grizzly bears. One thing I can be sure of is that there is a brown bear or a grizzly bear somewhere not very far from where I am standing right now. And this place is also very well inhabited with otters and seals and bald eagles and all the other kinds of critters.
Okay, that gives you a sense of Nell's enthusiasm. He sometimes took personal risks to capture the moment during these Encounters programs. He recorded one when he was strapped up in the branches of a hemlock tree, being battered and buffeted by an Alaskan gale. Another one, he was sitting on a rock in Sturgis Narrows of the Peril Strait, and while the ominous sound of the rising tide is surrounding him. So, as Debbie's mentioned, these are a legacy he leaves behind, which we should all cherish. After 100 episodes, he turned to working with filmmaker Liz McKenzie in Sitka on nature documentaries, And he also began recording natural sounds for an Alaska National Park sound library. This allowed him to spend more time in the wilderness in such places as Denali, Gates of the Arctic, and Glacier Bay National Park, the latter in collaboration with Hank Lentfer, who remembers Nels once saying to him, quote, "There's nothing I'd rather be doing, pure, unfiltered listening. It's a dream," end quote. Nils was attuned to sounds of all kinds. He was an excellent birder, one of the enthusiasms he shared with his partner, Debbie Miller. He loved music, especially drumming and the didgeridoo, and he had a real ear for language and accents, which he could mimic to great comic effect, much to the pleasure of ourselves, George and I, and to our students in the many anthropology field schools that we ran over the years in both Alaska and in Tasmania, Australia. And it was Nels who really convinced us to go to Tasmania when we were moving our semester-long field school. And the next few slides I'll go through quickly just to give you some scenes from those field schools. Nels was a great mentor to students. They loved his enthusiasm. He loved reptiles of all kinds, so Australia was wonderful. He was a great fixer. Here he woke up our students playing the didgeridoo in the mornings. That was quite the sight, quite the sound. And I love this picture. He was always energetic, always eager to make others laugh. And he found this piece of iron and then ran up the hill and posed. And maybe he earned his middle name King at this time.
I think we have to finish up.
All right, thank you. An environmental activist, Nels testified before Congress on the value of the Tongass National Forest and the other of Alaska's wildlands. He collaborated with Barry Lopez and Terry Tempest Williams on a book called Patriotism in the American Land. He argued that the deepest form of patriotism is one that defends the earth. He also served on the Sitka Conservation Society board for 40 years and had the ability to really distill complex policy issues and decisions down to their most important point. So finally, in leaving, this is the last slide, I just want to say that we, meaning George Gmelch and myself, look back now, both with sadness but also gratitude, on the life of a very singular anthropologist, communicator, and friend. Modest, charismatic, intensely curious and observant, adventurous, caring, and incredibly funny. Richard Nelson's work has touched thousands and had lasting influence on Alaska Native ethnography, subsistence research, ethnobiology, nature writing, and the environmental movement. And finally, Nels believed that the greatest contribution of cultural anthropology was the ability to document the wisdom and lessons of other cultures as a record for the future of those peoples, but equally as lessons for the rest of us. Through his writings, talks, radio programs, documentary films, and work with students, he had an exceptional impact in shaping how people view their relationship to nature that few, if any, cultural anthropologists have matched. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. The next speaker, Hank Lenfer, has written just a super book about Nels. And so I'm really glad that he's willing to share his experiences learning about Nels, both from research about him as well as experiences with him. So Hank, would you share with us?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, Bill. And as Debbie mentioned, first meeting Nels on the page. That's how I met him. I was a young man, just building a home in Gustavus, and within a few years of reading The Island Within, I had an opportunity to meet the man himself, and we hit it off pretty quickly. he only lived 100 miles away by boat, and we would invent reasons to, I'd go south or he'd go north about once a year, and our time together intensified through our shared love of sound, which he introduced me to as I was driving. I was his water taxi for some of his radio programs in Glacier Bay. And we ended up spending weeks, blending into months camping together, Glacier Bay and Denali. And around all those campfires, I would just hear all these stories that were not captured in any of his published writing. So I pushed him a little bit to write those down. He was adamant that he was done. I eventually asked if he minded me having a go at trying to write these down. So this book idea was born, which took us back to his house in Sitka, and we started hauling all this stuff out of the attic, out of the garage, out from underneath the bed. And I realized just how much material there was. So his journals from the villages were all stored in a giant metal ammo box, and a copy of his journal from the island within, which is in the thousands of pages, was just stored in boxes. So there was a total of over 8,000 pages of journal beginning from 1964 until the day he quit journaling after the publication of his Deer book. His mother was a pack rat, and Nels was a bit of a pack rat as well. So when his parents died, he discovered in their house every letter he'd ever sent home, all the way going back to first time he left home as a high school kid. So we had all those letters, most of which Nels had never read himself. There was college essays, high school journals, and he just handed all that stuff to me. I boxed it all up and took it to Gustavus. It took me a couple winters to read through it all and annotate it for my own purposes. Included in that bundle of stuff were report cards from high school. And Nels did not begin with an innate interest in other cultures. His interest was in other creatures, and specifically reptiles, because his father was asthmatic and he might have been more enamored with mammals, but he couldn't bring those home. But he did bring the reptiles home by the dozens. He filled his room with aquariums and cages. He eventually filled the garage. His parents had to park in the driveway. And he had a far more keener interest in those critters than he did in his classes. So here's a little quote from his high school English teacher in a course in which he received 3 Ds and an F, which is, I think, just fantastic for a guy that went on to become the Alaska State Writer. And his teacher wrote that Richard really needs to work on his grammar. He didn't complete several important assignments this quarter. Also, he persists in reading his book, Reptiles, of course, during class, even after many warnings. And I just think it's great that he, at that young age, was following his own interests, which ultimately served him so well. As an undergraduate, he had an opportunity to go to Alaska on a summer archaeological project on Kodiak Island, and Alaska almost lost him. And here's a letter he wrote home in 1961. Dear Mom and Dad, I found out by now that I am not a lover of the far north. This place is very beautiful in spots, such as some of the coastal beaches and the forest, but I don't like the cold, cloudiness, and the tundra. Alaska doesn't attract me like Arizona. We always see whales, porpoises, seals, and other interesting sea life, but I'm not so impressed. I miss the reptiles. It will have been a great experience for me, and I appreciate this, but I will try and get a job in the tropics next year. So now I'm going to try and share my screen. So Alaska did get him. This is 1964. He is just beginning graduate work in anthropology at in Madison. There was a project funded by the U.S. Air Force interested in creating a CI survival manual for Air Force pilots flying missions over the Arctic. He got offered the job by his major professor. And this first year really away from home was incredibly trying, predictable homesickness, but an unanticipated sense of homecoming, and that his obsession with the natural world in Madison was kind of viewed as freakish. And here in Wainwright, for the first time, he sensed community in which every member of the village was a keen naturalist, and fascination with the natural world wasn't a hobby, it was essential knowledge. And this really seeded a hunger that lasted for the rest of his life to integrate into some version of a community focused on the natural world. So what I want to do in the few minutes I have with you is two things. One, give a broad overview of the material that he left behind. And second, to briefly illuminate this arc he traveled from anthropologist to artist. So this is a journal page, the 2nd of September, 1964, a couple days after his arrival in Wainwright. And there's a pattern here that persisted through 50 plus years of journaling, which was he always began with the weather. He rarely did these elaborate drawings, but just a meticulous and dedicated and voluminous journaler. He also carried a camera, and he's left behind hundreds and hundreds of fantastic photos. So again, this is 64, 65 Wainwright. This is Wesley Eacock. There were no snow machines in the village at this time. It was still a dog team economy, and just some fantastic images. This is Tagaruk Bodfish, his closest neighbor that winter. They spent most evenings together. Tagaruk helped him learn the language, and here he is carving a kayak paddle for a kayak that they built together. And then photos like this. So this man is retrieving a seal he's just shot. And right here you can see where the day before seals have been hauled out of the water. And the day before you couldn't stand there because the ice was too thin. It's thickened up, and now, you know, they're retrieving another 20, 30 feet out from the lead. This is Andrew Eacock. Nels and I went back and visited this man in 2014 in Wainwright. There's an old man. He's now gone. And a group of buddies on the trail. So just stunning images that are all waiting to be archived and digitized. And if there's time, I'll speak to that at the end. So the other thing that we unearthed when we began this collaboration on this book were these old reel-to-reel tapes. So there was no phones, of course, in the village in '64. So his dad would place a reel-to-reel tape recorder in front of a television in Madison, record Green Bay Packers games, send those tapes all the way to the Arctic. Mom would throw in some socks and cookies. Nels, homesick, would listen to him repeatedly. And he had his own reel-to-reel machine, and he would thread them in and narrate letters for his parents. His parents saved them. I got them, took them to the state library here in Juneau and digitized them. So I'm going to play a single clip here, and the backstory here is he is coming back home to his house in Wainwright from a successful caribou hunt. He's rushing because there's a dedication of a new Assembly of God church, and he's got to deal with this animal. He's got frozen blood all over his parka that he's unaware of, and he grabs his hymn book, runs across, goes into church. And this is a little bit of him narrating to his parents.
After the song was over, I closed the hymn book and looked at it, and it was covered with blood. And I realized that my pants, both of my thighs on my legs, were just covered with blood, just soaked with blood from that caribou. And I inspected myself a little more. I saw I had blood all over the front of my coat and blood all over my shoes, and the floor was covered with blood where I was sitting. And Ecock looked over at me, the man I was sitting next to, this old fella, looked at me and saw I had blood on me, and he smiled just as to say, "Ah, good, you got caribou."
So that winter really hooked him into Alaska. He tried several times to live somewhere else and never could. He always had to come back. He just didn't find the types of communities he was looking for in the expanse of wild country he came to need anywhere else. And he went back to Wainwright to finish up his master's work. And while he was on campus, an editor from the University of Chicago came and asked his major professor if that professor would write a book about Inuit culture. And that professor took all of these monthly reports about sea ice that Richard had sent back to his professor, and he told this editor the book's already been written, and handed those reports. And that editor read them, and he found Nels on campus, tracked him down, and asked him if he'd like to publish a book with the press. So, you know, Nels told me that this is the only book he wrote that he wasn't aware he was writing at the time. And he wishes all books happen that way. And everyone after this one was much harder work. But it really realized, it woke him up to the possibility of being a writer. And as Sharon mentioned, he had a book with this press at a very young age. I'm going to jump forward 10 years. So he's already met George and Sharon. He's already got a PhD. He's got his second book out, Hunters of the Northern Forest. He's lived, just spent the winter in Ambler on the Kobuk River. And he's mushing here over Dalkey Pass into the Koyukuk drainage to spend a year here in Huslia. So he staked those dogs alongside this cabin, which belonged to Stephen and Catherine Atlep. That's the Koyukuk River in the background. So Stephen and Catherine really became his most important teachers. And here he is inside that cabin. And he describes in the letters and his journals from this time an almost desperation to capture as much of what he was learning as possible. And he felt that anything he didn't get down was somehow going to be lost. So he lost sleep. He would stay up so late writing. He would write until his hand cramped up. So here's a journal page from that time. And something I want to point out here is you see the headings, a wolf and moose, comma, dynamism, mink, or moose, comma, population trends. And in his previous two books, he had literally took his journals, copied them, cut them, pasted on to 5x7 cards, which are all part of his archive now, organized them by subject, and that became the formats for his books. He got savvy and realized, well, I'm going to start doing that up front, breaking it down by subject as he writes it down. But here's another thing that happens with his Huslia journal. This is the first time you see these diary sections. And as Sharon mentioned, he was a real advocate of participatory anthropology. And as he's written about, you can't learn to ride a bike by reading about it. You have to get on the bike and to understand what balance is. And likewise, Nels would say, you can't learn to set a trap properly until you've done it yourself. But what happens when you are exploring a spiritual worldview and you are devoted to participatory anthropology? You have to immerse yourself. It's a much more personal experience. And so we see this, this diary enter into in contrast to earlier journals, which were much more scholarly in nature. And you see that in Make Prayers to the Raven. He was criticized for this allowing the personal to come into that work. And he had a great editor at Chicago, David Brent, that said, to hell with the reviewers. This is the book anthropology needs. And he really backed Nels in allowing this, this personal to enter into his writing.
About 5 more minutes.
Okay. All right, I'm just gonna, so another piece that's in the archive are all these recordings that I made over the years of interviewing him. And here's just a snippet talking about his Koyukon experience.
You've been raised in a tradition that has tremendous insights into looking at the outside of a house and the beauty of its structure and the way it was constructed and how it works, and it's just all these brilliant insights, and you're completely absorbed in it, and all of a sudden somebody opens the door and invites you inside. And that's how I felt about being with Koyukon people and realizing, oh my God, there is another dimension that may exist in our world. And here are people who have invited you into the house, and they're filling your head with this incredible expanded view of what the world might be.
Yeah.
So he left Huslia, went to Sitka, of course. The whole, the island years were his attempt to integrate all he'd learned from these indigenous communities into his own life. But I want to speak to the creation of this book, which I don't think gets enough attention. So he wrote the Ethnography, Hunters on the Northern Ice. Almost 10 years later, he sat down to write this, a fictionalized account. And he was haunted for a decade by the lack of humanity in this ethnography. So he's just set out at great professional risk to try this fictionalizing of an ethnography. And as he wrote to his parents, he started writing this in Hawaii. I have no idea if it's terrific or terrible. It's so hard to write that a couple of hours drains me, but I can't imagine anything I'd like to achieve beyond writing something like this. And this, I'm going to read just from the introduction to this book. This isn't a descriptive account of a living culture, but is one that emphasizes the raw material of the senses as a means of communicating something of a people in their life way. It is in some ways a counterpoint to analytical scientific description, which is of course valuable in its own right, but often has a sense of life taken from it. And this was really the springboard to the island within. This, his movement towards experimenting with the lyrical and just his devotion to becoming an artist to do his best to share the richness of what he had learned from people and from critters. So I'm just going to read one final piece here. This is from his own journal from Sitka. And this is towards the end of the writing of The Island Within. I pick up the binoculars several times each day to look at the island, as if reaching over to touch a person I love and be touched in return. I look at the island and think, I'm doing this for you. There is such wonder loving a place as if it is another person. How strange to have reached my age without ever living in a way that allowed it. I have certainly read of it. I have lived with people who premised their whole existence on it, but I was not raised in a culture or community that allowed it to happen to me. There is only one way to know this love. Go to the land, become rooted in it, and let the love grow through intimacy and completeness of experience. It is no different than loving a person.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. Yeah. Karen, would you hook Josh in? And Josh, you have a few moments to share with us.
Okay, yeah, and then there is a question from David Ramser, but let me get Josh on here. That
Yeah,
David,
we'll have some time for.
that for question and answer.
Mhm.
Let me get Josh hooked in here. He has to unmute himself.
I thought I did.
Yep, there you
There
go.
it is. Hi, Josh.
Hi. Well, first, I guess thank you for putting together this session, and feel a little awkward being allowed to contribute to it in the way that people who've known Nels much better than myself have so much more to say about him. But like Hank and Debbie, I first kind of met Nels through his books. I read The Island Within when I was 18. I was living on Prince of Wales Island, the north end of the island, off the grid in a little cabin, and learning how to hunt deer and live up there. And so that's where I first met Nels. And actually, if I think back on it, that's why I went to graduate school and got into anthropology. Even if I didn't know why, I knew I wanted to do ethnography like Nels did, even if I didn't know what that really meant, which I didn't. But and then eventually, for me, that culminated in going to work in Northwest Alaska in the community of Shishmaref. And I started working up there in 2003, I think, and 2006, 2007, 8, 9 were the years I was there most intensively, and had like Nels, a hunting apprenticeship. I lived with a family during that period of time, worked on a hunting crew, fully immersed in a subsistence way of life. And my interest in doing that and in kind of following in the work he'd done is, you guys talked about how he contributed so much to the nature of subsistence work in Alaska. And yet at that same time, it changed so much away from ethnography of direct participation in that way of life and learning in that way. And I guess I wanted to, or had the arrogance to think I could, through a similar type of project, capture a way of knowing that was actualized through what people did and how people experienced things, and following Inupiaq pedagogy, which you guys all described as one that Nels got, which was learning and participatory ethnography is, of learning through total immersion, watching, in Inupiaq they would say mullik, to following and doing. And I kind of came to view through my experience that was the only way that one could really learn from hunters, was by learning with and alongside them. And Nels kind of was a mentor throughout that. My copy of not Island Within, but Hunters of the Northern Ice is so dog-eared and underlined, and lots of conversations with him. I didn't want to share my project with him. I was really intimidated by the idea of it, what he would think of it. And he was more funny than I had ever thought that he would be once we started talking about it, and especially after field work, when we could really compare our experiences. I felt like it was a moment where we both kind of exploded with things we wanted to say to somebody else who'd gone through a very parallel experience, even if it was separated by 40 years. Kind of in response to something you said, Sharon, like Nels as an ethnographer, he gets at something that they talk, like I think of Clifford Geertz talking about thick description. Some of these classic anthropological texts, Nels kind of really exemplified in ways that I don't think he ever fully got credit for, in terms of his depth of his contribution to how you do ethnography. Also, in terms of the role of descriptive ethnography, I heard Jim Carrey one time talk about, after his Topical Denina dictionary came out, how important descriptive ethnography was towards creating the information that you need to create something like that. And to me, that's kind of one of his unsung contributions, is how he did that. And then following that, like the real kind of journey of anthropology, to take all of that and then to seek to apply all of that in the context of your own life. Like, to me, his contribution beyond anthropology is saying, how do we take these experiences that we've had in our lives, these incredible transformational experiences and these incredible teachings, and continue to grow as individuals through the opportunities that we've had. And I think, to me, that was one of the beautiful parts of Nels's life trajectory is that part of it, how he takes anthropology, how he continues to be an anthropologist, but he becomes an ethnographer of himself through works like The Island Within, and then that culminates in the directions he goes from there. So I'd just like to add, Hank, in relation to Shadow of the Hunter, we were talking about it at one point, and he talked about, maybe it was when you guys went to Wainwright, or another time somebody had said to him like, oh, you wrote this book, and a Nukbak man, and he commented that he was just ready to get the once over about what this guy thought of it. And the guy looked at him and said, accurate, man. And he just really kind of speaks to, I think, what a great piece that was. And yeah, Nels was an incredible mentor and teacher. And the video that Bill mentioned was a talk we did in Sitka at the Mean Queen. It was a talk sponsored by the Sitka Maritime Heritage Society, and we just did an informal talk where we basically shared our experiences as hunting apprentices, him and Wainwright, me and Shishmaref, and has a bunch of pictures I took while I was out in the field, and we just basically talk about what our experiences were. And I told Nels afterwards that was the pinnacle of my anthropology, was being able to share that moment with him, and imagining my dissertation sitting on his desk was for me the greatest.
Thank you, Josh. Those are nice memories. Can we have some questions from the audience before we finish?
Yeah, we do have some that people have written. And for those of you in the audience, if you do want to ask your question out loud, there's a little raise your hand feature. And if you click on that, I'll see that and I can give you permission to speak. But both David Ramser and Ron Inoue have asked about the location of Nels's papers, photos, and recordings, and where they are being archived or deposited. So I guess that's a question for Hank.
Everything right now is in an archive room on campus in Sitka. And Nels wanted all of those to eventually end up in Fairbanks. And we met with staff from the Rasmussen Library about moving everything up there. And there's some issues with the journals, that there's some personal stuff in there that we're still trying to figure out how to deal with. The photos, we're ready to move, and we were going to move them, but I wasn't ready to be that far from them because I still needed them for this book project. And Nels's wish for those photos is to get them digitized and have copies sent to the respective communities. So I'll just put that out there, that's a project, as the folks in Fairbanks explained to us, is doable, but takes money. But that's a stipulation Nels had on those photos going, is that there's a commitment to get copies to the communities. And Nels had an offer from Texas A&M, who wanted all his papers. They offered him $80,000 to archive all of his work, and he said, no, I don't want any of this material leaving the state. So they will end up in Fairbanks. There's just a few things to figure out moving them between Sitka and Fairbanks, and how they become public is an ongoing discussion.
Somebody asked also about who Josh is, and I don't know if Josh, did you introduce yourself and explain your connection?
I sure didn't. My name is Josh Wisneski. I'm an anthropologist. I did my PhD work through the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and it was an ethnography of bearded seal hunting in Northwest Alaska. And I still work as an anthropologist here in Alaska as well as in Washington State.
Thank you. There's also a question from Vicky Weisenbaugh, hopefully I'm saying your name correctly. Hank, are the photos from Dick's time, are there any from Teneke Springs?
Yes, there are photos from Teneke Springs. There's several boxes of color slides. He was shooting slide film by the time when he was living in Teneke.
And is there any other questions, Karen?
No more written questions. I don't know if anybody would like to raise their hand and make a comment.
We think we could take one or two more. If not, I would thank all of you who contributed, and I think that the memory and the stories will continue. And I think it's been a great session. Thank you all.
Thanks, Bill.
If there are no other comments or questions, I guess I can make one about my connections with Nels. I went and I moved to Barrow or Utqiagvik in 1989 and worked there doing oral history work till 97. And Nels was certainly an inspiration to me, similar to Josh, in that having read his works and the type of ethnography he did certainly inspired me. And my books about life history books with people around Alaska and that sort of participant observation and writing in the first person personal style. And he actually helped edit my master's thesis, which is a life history of Harry Brower Sr., who's a whaling captain in Barrow. Nels helped transform it from a master's thesis into a book. And that was an invaluable contribution and helped, I think, teach me about how to write more in a literary way than in an academic way. And then, so I sort of had this like sort of peripheral connection with him. And then in 2001, I was traveling around in Australia and Tasmania, and had been backpacking in Tasmania, and was at, I don't know if we were on the side of the road. I think we were on the side of the road. We'd stopped to go in to see these penguins, and this person drives by, and I'm like, that was Richard Nelson. And he pulled over, and there we were in the middle of Tasmania, saying hi. And it's such a small world that you can run into somebody from Alaska way down there, and it was very fun. And to get sort of some firsthand advice on traveling around Tasmania from him. And I definitely made a good impression on my traveling companion that, I knew people all over the world. So he made great contributions for many of us in the anthropology ethnography community, that's for sure.
Well, super. We're on tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And we have a session on women's suffrage. And so we'll look forward to that. Please join us.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
It's been a pleasure. It's been fun. Thank you for all sharing.
All right.
Hopefully people won't have problem logging on tomorrow. I think one of the issues might be people getting reminder emails about the next session, and that might, if you click on that, it might not work for the one that's happening today. So in theory, it's all the same link and password and everything, but if you have problems, try to do it from the original confirmation email you were sent, if that makes a difference. And it also seems to be Zoom is giving people some problems with, it wants your Zoom login and email and password. And some people, it seems to ask that and others not. But anyway, Anne Polno from Sitka said cheers to Nels. So I think we should all raise a glass.
Yeah.
Nels.
Have one.
That's right. That we can go do for the rest of the afternoon.
Okay.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah.
My pleasure.